Voting is a moral issue because when we're deciding as a collective, we're deciding over high stakes issues. We're deciding matters of peace and war, poverty and prosperity, how we'll treat the poor, civil rights, and so on. We're not simply picking flag colors or choosing the national anthem. Voting is not like going to a restaurant and picking a food item there to eat yourself. Whatever the group decides is going to be imposed upon everybody, regardless of whether they like it or not, and regardless of whether they consent. Political scientists like to say that the median voter, the person kind of in the middle of policy opinions, decides the election. He's the one that gets his policies represented. What happens if the median voter would fail Econ 101? What happens if the median voter has systematically mistaken or misinformed views about foreign policy or the effects of war? What happens if the median voter doesn't understand how welfare policies work? What happens if the median voter overestimates the efficacy of some government programs and underestimates the efficacy of others? Well, they'll vote accordingly and we'll get systematically low-quality government. What does it take to be an informed voter? Some people think you just need to know the names of the candidates, but that's not really enough. You need to know something about what the candidates stand for, what they're likely to vote for, how much efficacy they're likely to have in Congress or whatever other position they have, because sometimes people aren't able to achieve their goals and you can often predict that ahead of time. But even beyond knowing that kind of stuff, you'll also want to be able to assess the policies that they're advocating. If you have one candidate who's in favor of free trade and another candidate who's in favor of protectionism, you're knowing that is not enough to make you an informed voter. You need to know something about the likely economic effects of free trade and the likely economic effects of protectionism in order to choose between them. Now, some people regard a message like this, when you say to voters, if you're going to vote, you should be well informed, they regard that as kind of elitist. Well, what's so special about knowing more? And my view is that there's lots of ways to be a good citizen. There's lots of ways to express civic virtue. Political participation is one of those ways, but it's nothing special. So if you're badly informed and you decide not to vote but decide to do something else to contribute to society, that's just as good. Thomas Jefferson says that if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. People at the founding period of the United States thought it was very important to have an informed populace. They didn't design democracy with the expectation that you have a large percentage of uninformed people voting. They designed it with the hope that people would be taking the responsibility of voting very seriously.
My name is Kurt Carlson. I'm an associate professor here at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University in the marketing department. It begins with the realization from previous work that I did that people who have relatively weak, undecided, if you would, preferences will actually seek out a very specific type of information en route to making a choice. Counter to maybe 50 years of research in which people believed that consumers or voters would seek information that confirms strong preferences, we find that when you move into these very weak preferences, people are not seeking information that confirms their preference. Rather, they're seeking information about the item they prefer, and they tend to like the negative information about that item more than the positive information about that item. So imagine that, that you could read one of two stories. Let's say the two stories had the following titles. 3 reasons why Barack Obama's policies are bad for the economy. Or 3 reasons why Mitt Romney's policies are bad for the economy. Which of those 2 would you rather read? Well, it turns out that if you have a strong preference for Mitt Romney, you'd prefer to read the negative story about Barack Obama because it confirms your preference. If you have a strong preference for Barack Obama, you would prefer to read the negative story about Mitt Romney. But if you have a weak preference for one of the 2 candidates, and here's where our observation, our behavioral regularity comes in. If you have a weak preference for one of those 2 candidates, you'll want to read the negative story about your candidate. we can examine the type of information that people will select and infer their preferences. We've been able to do that in consumer settings where individuals were told to conceal their preference, or where they were motivated to lie about their preference, or where they didn't even think they had a preference. And we were able to extract it from them without them knowing we'd done so, by simply asking what kind of information they would like to read about the alternatives. We then took it to the political landscape and said, well, maybe we can discover what people's voting preferences are when they're undecided. We examined a situation where we had 400 undecided voters, and we explored what kind of information they would like to read. We used that to infer what their voting preferences would be, and then we compared that to another sample of actual undecided voters who then voted and reported which way they'd voted in a post-election survey, in what's called an exit survey. We found that we were really good at predicting those exit survey results for people who were undecided recently and decided in the last minute, just like our sample, much better than any of the traditional polling techniques.